Welcome to another edition of our Reading the Signs podcast. I'm Rick Hinshaw, former editor of the Long Island Catholic, among other work in mostly Catholic communications. With me, as always, Dr. Jim Dolan, who's had a career of more than 40 years in the behavioral health field. We're going to talk today about the concept of restorative justice as an approach to the criminal justice system. And we're very pleased and privileged to have with us the Honorable Christopher G. Quinn, recently retired Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. Judge Quinn has served the New York State's legal system for more than 40 years, much of it in vital leadership roles, including as Deputy State Attorney General in charge of the Criminal Division, Supervising Judge in Nassau County District Court, and Supervising Judge in Nassau County Court. Of particular relevance, perhaps for our topic today, Judge Quinn established specialty courts for mental health, veterans treatment, adolescent diversion, and human trafficking. Welcome, Judge Quinn, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Let me begin by asking you about your understanding of and experience with the concept of restorative justice, what you understand it to mean, and how you've seen in its implementation. Has it been consistent with what it's supposed to be?
Interestingly enough, each of those particular courts that you mentioned, they have a different clientele. So every one of them has to be fashioned accordingly. Each of the stakeholders, the district attorney, the therapists, the defense bar, each of them has a different role, obviously, but each one of them had agreed, and put their efforts into it. And I know with Dr. Jim now, we created the mental health court. Each one of them agreed to it, put all their efforts into it, and always in an effort to assist the defendants in terms of what issue they had, whether they were a victim of some sort in terms of human trafficking. We took defendants. The concept was they're victims as well. With the mental health court, many people with mental illness get involved in criminal justice. Some of it is probably not their fault, but the mental health court gets them into treatment and consistent treatment over a period of time. So I do believe that the concept works. There are some issues with respect to victims, but many times in these cases, many of the victims are family members. Many times the family members are the ones that have reached out, are the victim of the crime, have been seeking assistance through all kinds of community services, and at the end, they're struggling. So it affects them as well.
How do you affect that balance? Because my own experience, whenever I've written about this or just reading about it, is there is that concern really among people who feel strongly about law and order, at least among advocates of restorative justice. There almost seems to be an over concentration in their view, a disproportionate concern about the perpetrators of crimes and not so much those victimized by crime.
Let me jump in at that point. I want the judge to respond to that, but I want to put in a little bit of a foundation that represents the evolution of my thinking on this topic in terms of whether or not restorative justice is a justifiable concept for implementation. And I began by asking myself, is it possible to abdicate one's role as a child of God? Because that's the underpinning from a spiritual and religious point of view for why we have these specialty courts, that people, perpetrators, criminals, they're entitled to second, third, fourth, fifth, 100th chance at getting it right. And as you're kind of indicating, Rick, sometimes the victim is forgotten about, or it seems, in that process. But does one abdicate their role as a child of God if they keep doing harm to others, they keep undermining stability and safety in the community? So I did think about Jesus on the cross, and he turns to the good criminal. After the good criminal says to him, "Can I be with you in heaven?" Something to that effect. And Jesus says, yes, you can. So in this criminal's final hour, Jesus, in effect, forgave him because he asked for forgiveness. He had faith. So my thinking went to the point that we don't have the right to play God, that we cannot take away the opportunity for that perpetrator, criminal, to make it right with God. And I think that from a spiritual, religious point of view, that's the foundation for why we had all these second chance courts, all these specialty courts. But I do want to get back to your point, Rick, that if there's so much of an emphasis on giving this defendant another opportunity, what kind of pain is the victim going through in the
Right,
process?
and remembering that victims oftentimes, I mean, some who are killed and their families have suffered a permanent loss, but some who they've suffered a violent crime, they are really affected psychologically, emotionally, the rest of their lives for that. And so, yeah, what I'm asking is there a restorative justice is supposed to mean for everybody involved in the crimes? What is being done for the victims?
My experience is in Nassau County, and there was victims advocates in the district attorney's office. I don't know how effective they are or what specific roles and programs they provide, but they are, for lack of a better term, handholders, and they perform a function. One of my recent trials was a child victim, and they were with her every step of the way. And I think because they were present in the courtroom, she felt more comfortable despite having a tragic set of facts. She was able to testify, and the defendant was found guilty.
And let me, Jim, I'll throw it back to you, but yeah, along that line, I mean, nothing is more moving to me than when I read of a crime victim or victim's family who is able to publicly forgive the person. And by and large, it's always, I can't say always, but every time I read it, it's people, victims of religious faith themselves. And as you mentioned, Christ. We Catholics have the example of St. Pope John Paul II forgiving the man who shot him, and there are so many others. So your point is very well taken, and another area, if you guys want to go into something else right now, but one of the things I think is important to remember for people who say, well, don't worry about the perpetrators, they're something evil, just lock them up, is unless we're going to throw away the key for everybody who goes into jail, we want to do all we can to make sure that they come out with a chance to reform their lives through things like education, through mental health treatment for substance abuse, addressing the root causes of crime. And we've talked about, how when there's family breakdown or kids grow up with no families at all, how that contributes to crime. So that's to get back to your point that it's very important, even for public safety, not just for the criminals themselves, but for public safety, that we do what we can to help reform those who are in prison.
Judge, can you talk a little bit about the criteria for a defendant to be allowed to have their case heard in a specialty court?
Well, each of the particular courts had separate criteria. The youth court obviously was age, generally not felonies. We actually sat with, I think, 50 superintendents of schools in Nassau County to try and set the program, to try and open the communication, so that in that particular case, the idea was that the child would not be out of school attending court and trying to resolve it as quickly as possible. Now, with the mental health court, you know better in terms of the criteria. I don't know how many months we did setting that court up, but we modeled it after other programs in parts of the state. We had a visiting judge from Buffalo come down to tell us how he ran his court. With respect to the veterans court that we had set up, there had to be a veteran. We had disputes with the district attorney at the time. She took a position that driving while intoxicated was not going to be permitted into that court. However, in time, she came around and started expanding it. Our goal was to, I guess, in a sense, pay back those individuals that were accused of committing crimes who had served our country. From my perspective, we opened it up on a Veterans Day week, so it was sort of, appropriate at the time. And I assigned a retired colonel judge to be the judge over it, just that he had a different perspective as to what they had gone through. Many of those cases were not that we didn't have major victims of involved in those cases. But I think all in all, I think the courts work. It's a method of reducing people's incarceration. It's getting them services that are available. It's specifically in the Veterans Court, we brought in the VA, a representative from the VA, and we were able to check their eligibility for services immediately. There was one issue where if a defendant was discharged with less than honorable, the VA was hesitant to assist them and work with them. We cut a deal that they would assist them at a certain point, but if they were dishonorably discharged, they weren't eligible for the court. So the criteria changed with each court, and each particular court, we assigned I felt assigned a judge that was appropriate for that. In our youth part, I had a female justice who had 2 teenage children at the time. So the perspective from the judge is very important. The buy-in, for lack of a better term, for the judge is very important as well, and the buy-in from all the stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Are violent offenders allowed to be under these specialty courts?
In terms of felonies, the violent offenses are generally not. That perspective is more in terms of plea bargaining, in terms of negotiating with the prosecutor and defense lawyer. If there's an underlying cause, an underlying reason. Every time that I had a violent offense or a felony, for lack of a better, if an individual had an abuse problem, if they were out on bail, I wanted to see them take responsibility in some form or fashion, get into a program, hopefully succeed in the program. Obviously, you know better in terms of people failing in programs, giving them a second chance and a third chance. The felony diversion court is specifically legislated by the legislature. That has certain criteria, and one of the judges that was assigned there, he actually had a substance issue in his life, so he could relate to the defendants when they were there, and everybody who appeared in front of him appreciated him. His position was, we'll do our best deal right now. You've got to do what you got to do, and if you violate the terms and conditions and you relapse, then chances are you're going to get put into custody. And that was the hammer at the end of it. Obviously, he was very understanding in terms of their issues and problems, and I think he was pretty successful in doing so.
Judge, I know that you're a man of faith. To what extent, knowing that there's sentencing guidelines and rules that you have to play with as a judge, but as a man of faith, are you able to operationalize your belief system into the judicial process?
It is an internal process with each and every judge, I believe. I certainly take everything into account. I've often been asked, how tough is it to sentence somebody? And after this many years doing it, I didn't have a problem doing it. And my position was the person did most of it to themselves, but I always took into consideration their background, their upbringing, their social status. I had a case many years ago. A young lady was in front of me, and I think she was in her teens, and she was with her 3rd or 4th child, and she had been arrested and had been arrested a 2nd or 3rd time. And I just said to myself, this young lady never had a chance. So I released her. The district attorney wanted her to be put into custody. I released her, understanding that by keeping her out, I was impacting the lives of 2 or 3 of the children. I was impacting her life. She went through a program called WORK. I don't know if you were familiar with it at the time. I don't think it exists anymore. Women's Opportunity Resource Center. And she was a successful graduate. She was able to get a job. So from that perspective, I think I did the right thing. People ask me, what does it take to be a judge? And I have a very odd answer at times. I have said, I think being a parent is an important aspect of it. Learning to deal with disputes with children, just perspective on life. And that's not to say if you don't have children, you can't be a very good judge, but I think that adds something to it. And in doing so, it's not just parenting, it's your background, your faith, your understanding of it all.
Wow.
Yeah, I'd like to affirm that the idea that, yeah, understanding the fullness of where a person comes from and the more our own life experiences, as a parent, as just a citizen living in the community, dealing with the same issues and fears about crime that we all do. I had written a blog post on restorative justice a year or two ago, and one of my regular readers, who's very good, usually very supportive, but she took issue with the idea that, well, she said basically, well, I take the side of the victims, the people who did this should stay in jail. But then she said, I had made reference to, children who grow up without any effective parenting. Sometimes they grow up, with drug addicted parents or, a mother whose boyfriends come in and beat the kids or whatever. And she wrote back and said, well, when they're adults, they need to be responsible for themselves. And I wrote back and said, we who talk about family values, we emphasize the importance of good parenting, of children having parents and of parents taking responsibility. But then when some parents don't, we don't take that into account when the kids predictably turn into criminals because they've never known anything but violence and deprivation themselves.
I couldn't agree with you more. As a judge, we were required, and now judges will be required every year. I was required every 4 years to go to an institution where I could sentence somebody to local jail, prison, secure youth facility. We talked about education before. In the secure youth facility, there was amazing education going on. I mean, the things that they didn't have the opportunity while they were in their community, they now had. Many people take advantage of it. Not every one of them, but there are resources available. So I know if you take a youngster off the street and he's committed a serious felony, if he's going upstate, he will have the opportunity to get his GED, to possibly get a community college degree. And there are certainly trades as well as they teach as well. So,
Judge, can you tell us a little bit about human trafficking court?
that was one that we had set up just as I was leaving. But the concept was, and we had to assign an Asian interpreter to the part because many of the defendants that were being brought out from the Flushing area where there's a high Asian population, and the whole idea was to find out the true story behind it. They were arrested for oftentimes prostitution. Was there somebody behind it? Was there a John, a pimp, whatever they call them these days? Were they in distress and not being able to speak? It's very difficult to take somebody who doesn't speak a language to get them to trust you. And with the assistance of the interpreter, oftentimes it was helpful. However, still at times they're not seeking the services. They want to get back into the community as quickly as possible. And oftentimes prostitution is not generally a higher level crime. If you looked in today's paper, I think there were 8 people arrested for prostitution out of some spa in Nassau County. That would be the targeted group for that type of court.
Rick mentioned about my background in mental health, and one of the black marks, I would say, on the mental health system was the policy of deinstitutionalization. It's a well-meaning policy. It started back in the late 1950s, 1960s, and the intention was to stop the warehousing of people with mental illness and keeping them, so to speak, incarcerated for many decades in these state hospitals. And sometimes they were, or I should say, oftentimes they were victims of harsh custodial treatment. And what the state did also, they realized that, well, if we weren't in the business of hospitalizing for these very lengthy periods of time, we can also save a ton of money. So the political right and the political left came together, one saying individual liberty is what it's all about, the other saying, well, this is going to be a big money saver. And the state hospitals and even private hospitals, to some extent, opened their doors. And these people who in the past were psychiatrically hospitalized for much of their lives were suddenly in the community without the ability to live independently in the community. And I could say there are people, and Rick, you were talking about individuals who grow up in families where I guess one of the things they know most about life is problem solving through violence. And you have people with mental illness whose brains don't work right. who are not capable of living independently, and if they are going to be in the community, they need to have supervised living. But it gets to the point that if one would, and I was talking earlier about uh, the human dignity and the child of God status, but that doesn't necessarily mean to me that we have to subject the community to someone who is incapable of living in the community. Perhaps people must be in highly supervised settings in order to maximize their ability to make themselves right with God, to maximize their ability to be a good person. So prisons, we're talking about employability and education. It seems to me that the mental health system has kind of punted to the criminal justice system to say, you got to take care of these guys. And but the criminal justice system was like, well, we're not experts in mental health. We don't know about treatment, education, and comprehensive discharge planning to make sure that there's a smooth transition into the community. So, Judge, where are we with that in terms of the criminal justice system adapting to the institutionalization?
I would think the best answer is they have not adapted well. The legal system hasn't addressed the fact that in terms of culpability, we only have not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect or an emotional disturbance to reduce a crime. There has to be more in terms of services. You're right about the prisons. I don't know. I haven't visited prisons where they have these types of services and the extended comprehensive release plans. It's entirely important. We don't have enough, and we don't address until too late somebody who's in severe crisis. And back to what I said earlier, it ends up becoming a parent who calls. In today's paper, there's a family in Suffolk County suing the Suffolk County Police Department. Retired correction officer was having mental health issues, and he came at them with a knife and ended up being shot and killed.
Yeah.
Now they're suing because they didn't follow protocols. I know members of the public say, where has that family been? If you think about it, you know better. The struggles of the family, putting up with that for so many years, what happens, what they go through, the lack of services, the struggling to pay for services. We need to do an awful lot for when you drive around and see the number of homeless people in our major cities and the living conditions that they go through. And yet the civil liberties folks, you have to leave them alone. Well, sometimes it's for their best benefit that they have some type of supervised program. Yes, it all should be done with due process, but it's a problem in America that we really have to address.
Yeah, and you make a good point there, Judge. Jim talked about for the sake of society, having people out in the community who can't care for themselves, who might turn violent, who, live in conditions that harm the whole. But for those people themselves,
Exactly.
we're not doing them any favors. You point out, Jim, we really went from one extreme to the other, opening the doors of warehousing kind of mental institutions will get people out of there, seemed good at the time, but going in the opposite way where they're all just on the streets, not getting any kind of help, is not fair to them or to the community.
Yeah,
So
we know that about 50% of the inmates in jails and prisons are mentally ill.
Mhm. Yeah.
So the prisons and jails have become the new psychiatric hospitals for the bulk of the people who need supervised care.
Judge, let me ask you one other aspect, and this doesn't come into your courts, but I'm reading more and more about restorative justice being employed at the school level to settle disputes. And by disputes, I'm talking about the mistreatment of some students by others. And again, I've read different commentary by more conservative writers who are deploring this because they're saying what happens is a kid constantly bullies another kid, and then they just bring them both together, sit them down and talk, and there's no discipline for the perpetrator. Now, I don't know how accurate that is. It does suggest there's always the danger of restorative justice programs being in the hands of ideologues who really don't see the full. Obviously, what it seems like is the answer to that would be some clear discipline for the perpetrator, which satisfies the victim's desire for justice. Then maybe you can sit them down and
Well, I don't know what level you're talking about in terms of education,
yeah, I
but
think like middle school and high school.
well, I personally think that that should be involved. There should be some form of that in terms of a peer type court. We don't have one in Nassau County. There are some counties that have it. But there's nothing wrong with the peers figuring out either the punishment, who's telling the truth or not, etc. I think it's a good step. I think it should be viewed as a preventative step, something to show some consequence, and that it impacts the youth so that they don't go into something further. I'm not an ideologue one way or another, but I would love to see keeping youth out of court as much as possible. And that was the reason we set up the youth part. Get them in, get them out, get them understanding what they've done, get the school involved so that they know what's happening, and taking the child out of educational setting for lengthy periods of time does nobody any good, in my view. But
in preparation for the show, I did an analysis of rates of crime from country to country, and also rates of crime based on socioeconomic factors. And one of the consistent variables that I shouldn't say seem to, but apparently had a direct impact on whether or not someone is involved in crime or even a victim of crime was whether or not they come from a intact family, where both the father and the mother are in the same home. And that brings me to the concept of employability. There's too many guys out there who are criminals who are really not employable, and they don't seem to have the skills. And that's one of the areas I think the criminal justice system, when they do have the guy, is to really try to give him skills so he is employable and, from a woman's point of view, worth marrying.
it's a societal issue. I don't feel confident that I can make changes in it. I was the end result part of it, dealing with it, but it certainly is an issue. And the breakdown of the family is visible in almost every criminal case you can see. Not every, obviously, but it's a substantial amount. I had a young African-American boy, probably 16 or 17, before the change of the age. He got involved with older kids on a robbery. The two older boys, 19, were held in custody. And this young man's father, the parents were divorced. Mom had custody, but dad was in court. And it impressed me so that he took the time. He left his job. He knew his son was in trouble. And I had a long discussion with him. And I was convinced by his statements that he was going to be in the middle of his son's life. It was obvious that he was dragged in as a young man to the older kids, but I released him to his father's custody, and his father agreed that he would keep track of him. The lawyer came to me a couple of weeks later, and he said, "Judge, I don't think any of your colleagues would have done that. And I can tell you right now, I've heard from the father, and the kid is in school, and he's doing much better." So sometimes the judge has to take a chance. A lot of judges don't like to, because in newspapers, they hear something happen. It's a fact of life. If you're a judge, you're going to get bad press once in a while.
Well, you're doing God's work, Judge. Rick, I know you want to kind of end the show by telling about what we're going to talk about next time.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us, and please join us again in 2 weeks when we're going to pick up on the ongoing celebration of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the birth of our nation. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about our roles and responsibilities in serving our country and upholding our democratic values and in appreciating the history and the sacrifices that have gone in all the generations before us. So tune in again in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, gentlemen.